All right, everybody. So as we mentioned last class, today I am asking that you go through notes A and fill everything out as we go along. This is going to be the beginning of our unit, and we're going to get introduced to a couple characters that are going to follow us through really the next 20, 30 years of American history. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, where we pick up is in 1824. If you remember, 1824 is the end of the era of good feelings, the end of that time period that we discussed of political unity, where the Democratic Republicans had ruled for a very long time. It was not a perfect era, as there were elements of sectionalism. Alexander Hamilton had been killed. The North and the South were introduced to this growing region of the West, and that had to be accounted for in politics. So it wasn't a perfect time, but it definitely was one of the most unified times we had had as a young republic. Now, in 1824, James Monroe left office, and he left the election in the hands of these four individuals. Now, on the left, we have John Quincy Adams. We've met John Quincy Adams before because he was James Monroe's Secretary of State. He's also the guy that single-handedly created the Monroe Doctrine and really pieced that together. In the middle, we have Henry Clay. Henry Clay should be a familiar figure for you as well, as we first met him as a war hawk from the state of Kentucky. He wanted to go to war with Great Britain, but we also saw him during the Missouri Compromise, where he authored the document that established the 3630 line on the map for where slave states and free states could be. In the middle is kind of a random name, William Crawford. We are not going to see him again after this election. And then off to the right is the probably the most transformative figure out of all of these individuals, and that is Andrew Jackson. Now, please note where each one of these is from, okay? John Quincy Adams is from Massachusetts, that's in the north. Clay is from Kentucky in the west. Crawford from Georgia in the south. And then Jackson is from Tennessee, which would also be considered a Western territory at this time. So when the votes came in, what you want to understand is a little bit of each background. Adams and Clay were well known for their political stance, but Andrew Jackson was much different. He was not a politician. In fact, he hated politics, really. He was a war general. He had become very famous from his Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He was well liked by the men around him for the most part. Now he had a lot of character flaws and had a lot of things that also rubbed people the wrong way, but he was relatively popular amongst the common people in America. Now, the problem was, despite his popularity, when you run four candidates for a presidential election, it can be hard to actually win a majority. The Constitution mandates that the president wins 51% or more of the electoral vote. Well, when the vote came in, Jackson led the popular vote, which again, a popular vote is just counting up all the votes in America and then dividing them by how many they received. Jackson got 43%. Adams trailed in 31%, and then Clay and Crawford were in a very distant third and fourth. So what happened here is that when you count up all the votes in America, 43% of Americans voted for Andrew Jackson, or at least Americans that could vote, and only 31 voted for Adams. Now, here is the electoral map. A couple things you want to look at here is that here is the popular vote. Here are the numbers we just talked about. But look here at the electoral vote, okay? Jackson won 38% of the electoral vote because remember, each state is worth a different amount. And Adams won 32%. So Jackson won both the popular and the electoral votes in terms of the most, but he didn't win enough to win the majority. So look at where Jackson wins a lot of his states, okay? He's well beloved in the West. He's well beloved in some of the southern states. He even took Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which were very big wins for him. But his main competitor is Adams, and Adams is almost primarily from the North. I mean, that's all of his votes and all of his, really his pieces here. So when it comes down to it, none of them won. None of the four actually won the Electoral College vote because nobody won a majority. And so when this happens, and this is still true today, if nobody wins the electoral vote, then what happens is the decision goes to the House of Representatives. Remember, the House of Representatives is the House in Congress that's more representative of the population because it's determined by population rather than just equality. And so the House gets to decide. Now, in 1824, the Speaker of the House was Henry Clay. And while Henry Clay knew that he was out of the race, he did see this as an opportunity to maybe achieve and move up into the political realm. And you got to remember these politicians are very smart. And Henry Clay looks at some of the people who've gone before him, like Monroe and Madison and Jefferson, and he wants to win the presidency. And he realizes that usually to be president, the position you fill before is the Secretary of State. And it happened for Madison, happened for Monroe, and so on. And so he decided to pull a deal. And even though Jackson won more of the votes, Henry Clay, I can just imagine this, decided to call John Quincy Adams. Said, "Hey man, you know how you didn't win all the popular votes? Yeah, well, you know how you didn't win the electoral votes?" And John Adams like, yeah. Thanks, I appreciate the reminder. He says, "Well, tell you what, I'll cut you a deal. I will manipulate the vote in the House, and I'll make you president. But I want something in return, and what I want in return is the position of Secretary of State." And these two guys kind of make a deal behind the table, if you will. And Adams, when the vote comes in, ends up winning the presidency. Clay wins the Secretary of State. And the only one who was left out is Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson felt robbed, and rightfully so. I mean, again, he won the popular and the electoral vote, but he lost the actual election. And so he's going to be pretty darn mad about all of this and pretty upset. And he destroys Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. He calls this whole thing a corrupt bargain. He blasts Clay and Adams. He hates them for the rest of his life. In fact, Jackson calls Clay the Judas of the West, that he betrayed the American government. And Clay and Adams actually undercome a lot of heat for this. In fact, there's so much heat that John Randolph from Virginia, the guy on the right here, criticized Clay to the extent that Clay was so emotional about it, he challenged Randolph to a duel because, as politicians in the early 1800s, when you don't agree, what other way to settle your differences than to go out and pretend to shoot each other with pistols? Now, luckily in this case, none of them hit, and unlike Hamilton, both of them survived. But you start to see just how intense this dislike is for each other. So that corrupt bargain really limited what John Quincy Adams was able to do during his presidency, because he was not really trusted by the people. A lot of people felt like he didn't really deserve it. He also had some sectional issues that proved a little bit too much for him to be able to deal with. And so 4 years went by, and John Quincy Adams didn't really achieve much, kind of a lame duck presidency. And 4 years go by, and by 1828, the presidential election is up again, and John Quincy Adams, to run for re-election, is up against a familiar foe, Andrew Jackson. But this time, Andrew Jackson is coming at him with a whole lot more fire. Now, Andrew Jackson actually creates his own political party during this time called the Democrats, and he splits the Democratic Republican Party in half. And on one side, John Quincy Adams becomes the National Republicans, and on the other, we have the Democrats. And good news for those of you who are having trouble keeping track of political parties, the Democratic Party here is still the same one that created today. And so we're getting close to the same political parties that are easier to keep track of. But when Jackson ran again in 1828, as a candidate from Tennessee, his followers really presented him as someone who was sympathetic to the concerns of the common man. They really tried to play on this idea that John Quincy Adams represented the elite and represented someone who didn't care for the average American individual and wasn't going to represent their interests. And the political mudslinging between Adams and Jackson was awful. Adams' men really tried to attack Jackson because Jackson was a rough individual, folks. In fact, a lot of people felt like he was illiterate. He slurred his words, that he drank too much. But they really started going after him, and it wasn't until they started attacking his family that Jackson really started to take exception. In fact, John Quincy Adams, along with his support from Henry Clay, starts launching attacks on his mother. They called his wife an adulteress, and it actually caused so much stress on his wife that Jackson's wife, Rachel, actually ends up dying about a month after the election. Now, she was a sick woman. However, the stress that it caused her, a lot of people feel like it was too much for her. But when the vote came in, as you see from this election, look at the numbers here. It's obvious that Jackson's message is heard. This time, he leaves no doubt. He wins 68% of the electoral vote. And in 1828, Jackson becomes the American president. Now, why? You might ask yourself, why did he do so much better in 1828 than he did in 1824? Well, what you want to understand about this is the reason that Jackson was able to win the presidency in 1828 so handily is that a couple of things had changed during the 4 years that preceded this. During the 1820s, from 1824 to 1828, many states had done away with the idea that you had to own property to vote. And when they did away with this requirement, there was a dramatic increase in the amount of voter eligibility. So now, yes, you still had to be white and you still had to be male, but now that you did not have to own property, you now introduced an entirely new demographic, essentially a middle and lower class demographic that wouldn't have voted in 1824. And so we see the number of voters in the election of 1828 actually double from 1824. And this campaign that Jackson ran to appeal to the common man was so successful because he actually had some common people, common men really, voting in the politics. So this surge in political participation and this understanding that now it was not just about appealing to the academic elites who were voting, it was about appealing to the average individual, is going to really change politics forever. And a lot of politicians are going to develop what are called grassroots campaigns, which are more localized campaigns to really win their support. So that is Notes A. Please pay attention to this relationship that Jackson has with Adams and Clay and how he really starts to hate them for this corrupt bargain. But in the end, Jackson gets the last laugh, and this is going to be his opportunity to kind of exact some revenge over the next couple of years. So that's all for Notes A. Please reread if you would like, and then I will see you guys soon.